Christopher Columbus staked his life on a catastrophic math error and accidentally stumbled upon an entirely new world. His name is known to every student, Christopher Columbus, the man who discovered America. But behind this simple textbook fact hides one of the most dramatic, contradictory, and tragic stories of the Age of Discovery. This is the story of how a Genoese navigator, relying on brilliant intuition and at the same time a catastrophic miscalculation, managed to convince the most powerful monarchs in Europe to finance the most audacious and risky expedition in history. It is the tale of his desperate voyage in 3 small caravels across an immense and terrifying ocean that nearly ended in mutiny and failure. It is the narrative of a triumph, of that moment when, after weeks of despair, the longed-for cry of land echoed, and of how the man who gifted an entire continent to Spain was received in his homeland as a hero. But it is also the story of a tragedy, of why Columbus, until the end of his days, was fanatically convinced that he had only found a new and short route to Asia, and not a new world, and of how the great admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy of all the lands he discovered, ended his life in poverty, oblivion, and in chains. A journey to a world where maps were blank canvases, where myths and reality were closely intertwined, and where the obsession of a single man could change the map of the world forever. The story of Christopher Columbus, like that of many great men whose actions changed the world, is full of gaps and enigmas, starting with his birth. To this day, heated debates persist about his exact origin, whether he was Italian, Spanish, or even Portuguese. But the most accepted and documented version maintains that he was born in 1451 in the prosperous Republic of Genoa, into the family of a humble weaver and wool merchant of limited means, Domenico Colombo. His world, from early childhood, was inseparably linked to the sea. Genoa, in the 15th century, was a maritime power, a true mistress of the seas. Its trade galleys and caravels navigated the entire Mediterranean, from Gibraltar to Constantinople. The smells of the port, the smell of salt, of fish, of tarred ropes, and of exotic goods, were the air he breathed. The young Christopher, most likely, did not receive a systematic and university education. His school was the ship itself, and his teachers were the rough and hardened captains and sailors. From adolescence, he began to sail on merchant ships, first as a cabin boy, doing the hardest work, and then as a sailor. It was a tough but invaluable school of life. He learned everything a true sailor had to know: how to tie hundreds of sailor knots, how to hoist and reef the heavy sails in a storm, how to navigate by the stars and by the primitive compass. He sailed to the island of Chios in search of the prized mastic resin. He was in England and Ireland, and perhaps even reached Iceland on one of his voyages, where he might have heard the ancient Norse sagas about Vinland, a mysterious land far to the west. He saw different countries, heard different languages, and most importantly, in the noisy port taverns, he eagerly listened to the sailors' stories. Stories about distant and unexplored islands that supposedly lay somewhere beyond the horizon in the Sea of Darkness. Around 1476, destiny, in the form of a naval battle off the coast of Portugal, in which his ship was sunk, threw him to Lisbon. Columbus, clinging to a piece of an oar, miraculously reached the shore, and this accidental and tragic episode became the turning point of his life. He found himself in the absolute center of global geographical knowledge of the time. Lisbon, at the end of the 15th century, was a city obsessed with a great idea: the search for a direct sea route to India. Portuguese navigators, under the patronage of the famous Prince Henry the Navigator and his successors, year after year, methodically, like stubborn ants, advanced further and further south along the unexplored and terrifying coast of Africa, mapping new capes, rivers, and bays. In Lisbon, Columbus, working in the cartographic workshops of his brother Bartholomew, had access to the most advanced, often secret, knowledge of his time. He studied Portuguese portolan charts, read the works of ancient geographers like Ptolemy and Strabo, and devoured Marco Polo's Book of Marvels, which described the incalculable riches of China, Cathay, and Japan, Cipangu. He maintained correspondence with the leading scholars of his time, such as the famous Florentine astronomer Paolo Toscanelli, one of the main defenders of the idea that the East could be reached by the Western route. And it was here, in this unique atmosphere of great discoveries, bold hypotheses, and precise calculations, that the idea definitively formed and crystallized in his mind, becoming the work, or rather, the obsession of his entire life. An idea that seemed brilliant in its simplicity to most of his contemporaries, but absolutely insane in practice. While all the Portuguese, the innate flower of the nation, focused on reaching the rich India with its spices, silks, and precious stones, by sailing east, skirting Africa, along a long, dangerous, and almost fully explored route, Columbus was convinced India could be reached much more easily and quickly by sailing in the opposite direction, directly west across the Atlantic Ocean. This idea was not entirely new. The fact that the Earth was shaped like a sphere had been known to educated people since the time of the ancient Greeks. But between theory and practice yawned an abyss of terror. The Atlantic Ocean, in the mind of medieval man, was the sea of darkness, an infinite space infested with giant sea serpents and other monsters, beyond which lay nothing but the abyss. But Columbus was not a simple dreamer. He was a practical man. He sought and collected evidence. He listened to the stories of sailors from the Azores and Madeira who claimed that, far to the west, after long storms, they had found on the shore pieces of worked, non-European wood, carved canoes, or even the bodies of unusual-looking people. He studied maps depicting mythical islands like Antillia or St. Brendan's Island, considering them not a fiction, but actually existing yet undiscovered lands, which could serve as intermediate bases on the way to Asia. But the main thing was that he, like many geniuses, made a catastrophic but ultimately fortunate error in his calculations. Based on the works of Ptolemy, who greatly underestimated the circumference of the Earth, on the accounts of Marco Polo, who greatly exaggerated the extension of Asia to the east, and by incorrectly converting Arabic miles into the shorter Italian miles, he arrived at two absolutely false but very inspiring conclusions. First, he believed that the circumference of the Earth was approximately 1/4 smaller than it actually is. And second, he was convinced that there was no such massive ocean between the eastern coast of Asia and Europe. In his worldview, in his calculations, there was no giant Pacific Ocean between Europe and Japan, Cipangu, and certainly not two enormous American continents. There was only a relatively small and perfectly navigable stretch of sea. According to his calculations, the journey from the Canary Islands to Japan should be only about 2,500 to 3,000 miles. The actual distance was nearly 12,500 miles. It was precisely this double and grandiose error that gave him that unshakable and fanatical confidence that other, more educated scholars lacked. He was absolutely convinced that his project was not only possible, but easy to execute, and that it would take no more than a month. Around 1483, he finally made up his mind and presented his bold project to King John II of Portugal. He was heard by a special board of mathematicians, made up of the best cosmographers, astronomers, and mathematicians in the kingdom. They examined his calculations carefully and without prejudice, and arrived at a unanimous and devastating conclusion for Columbus. Columbus was radically wrong. The distance to Asia was much, much greater than he claimed, and no ship of the time, with its limited reserves of water and food, could cover such a distance. The project was rejected as fantastical and unfounded. For Columbus, it was a massive blow. Rejected in the country that was the world leader in navigation, he did not give up. In 1485, after the death of his wife, along with his young son Diego, he left Portugal and headed to neighboring Spain to try his luck there. He was going to offer his great mistake, his brilliant dream, to the main competitors and enemies of the Portuguese crown, the Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Upon arriving in Spain in 1485, Christopher Columbus was a nobody, a foreigner, a Genoese with a noticeable Portuguese accent, no money, no influential contacts, and with a young boy, Diego, holding his hand, and with a single, almost insane idea, which had already been officially rejected by the best scholars and navigators in Portugal. But he was obsessed. And that obsession, that almost fanatical, irrational faith bordering on madness in his own rightness and in his divine destiny, was his main and only driving force. His first refuge in Spain was the monastery of La Rabida, located near the port of Palos de la Frontera, in the southwest of the country. It was a wise decision. The Franciscan monks, many of whom were highly educated men interested in geography, astronomy, and who themselves participated in missionary journeys, became his first audience. They did not laugh at him. They saw in his eyes the fire of true faith, and in his calculations a logic that was perhaps debatable, but bold and fascinating. The prior of the monastery, Juan Perez, who had been a confessor to Queen Isabella herself, sympathized with Columbus. It was he who, using his old contacts at court, helped him get his first audience, an almost impossible feat for a simple foreigner, with the Catholic monarchs, Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. In January 1486, Columbus appeared for the first time before the Spanish monarchs in the city of Alcalá de Henares. The scene was surreal. Spain at that time was a massive military camp, completely absorbed in the final and decisive stage of the Reconquista, the war against the Emirate of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. All the money, all the forces, all the thoughts of the crown, and the entire nation were directed toward this holy war. And then, before them, during a break between war councils, appears this strange, tall, red-headed foreigner with burning eyes. And amidst conversations about fortress sieges and troop movements, he begins to tell them about the fabulous riches of India, the golden roofs of the great Khan's palaces in China, the deposits of precious stones on the island of Cipangu, Japan, and that he, Christopher Columbus, knows a short, safe western route to those treasures. He asked for little: 3 ships, a crew, and royal patronage. King Ferdinand, a cold, cynical, and pragmatic politician, was openly skeptical of the project from the very beginning. He saw before him just another dreaming adventurer. But Queen Isabella, a deeply and passionately religious woman, inclined to make bold, almost mystical decisions, became interested. The idea not only of finding gold, but of spreading the Christian faith to countless new pagan peoples of the East, flanking the Muslim world, was highly attractive to her. It was the continuation of her own crusade. It was decided, as in Portugal, to create a special commission of the most renowned scholars, theologians, and cosmographers of the kingdom. It was presided over by the Queen's own confessor, the influential Hernando de Talavera, and for Columbus began long, agonizing, and humiliating years of waiting, which dragged on for nearly 7 years. This commission met intermittently, over months, then years. They listened to Columbus, studied his maps, verified his calculations, compared them with the works of ancient authors and with the Bible, and time and again they arrived at the same devastating conclusion for Columbus as the Portuguese. Columbus was radically wrong. The ocean was much larger than he thought. Asia was much farther away. His project was technically impossible and theologically doubtful. Columbus lived all that time on a modest pension that the Queen paid him from time to time out of her own pocket. He was forced to follow the royal court, which under wartime conditions constantly moved from one city to another, from Cordoba to Salamanca, from Salamanca to Malaga. He became a laughingstock, a local attraction. Courtiers laughed at him behind his back. Children in the streets, seeing him from afar, pointed at him and tapped their temples, shouting, "There goes the one looking for the land that doesn't exist." They called him the visionary, the mad Genoese. He was desperate. Several times he was on the verge of giving it all up. He wrote to his brother Bartholomew that he was trying to pitch his project in the courts of England and France. He secretly approached the King of Portugal again, who, after the new discoveries by Diaz, had definitively bet on the African route. But everywhere he received a polite but firm refusal. Almost 7 years passed. 7 years of humiliation, poverty, mockery, and almost extinguished hope. The Talavera Commission issued its final and negative verdict. The project was officially rejected. And then, in early 1492, when Columbus, completely defeated, was already leaving the royal camp on the outskirts of Granada to move to France forever, an event happened that changed everything. On January 2nd, Granada fell. The last Moorish bastion was taken. The Reconquista, which had lasted almost 800 years, had triumphantly concluded. Spain was united and free, The monarchs, the whole country, were in a state of euphoria, of religious and patriotic fervor. The coffers were absolutely empty after a long and ruinous war, but ambitions were limitless. It was at that precise moment, the moment of greatest triumph, that Columbus's friends at court, mainly the influential royal treasurer Luis de Santangel, who managed the crown's finances, made a last, desperate attempt. Santangel obtained an urgent audience with Queen Isabella and delivered a speech that changed history. He did not speak of geography or calculations. He spoke of politics, glory, and lost opportunities. He said, "Your Majesty, you have just concluded the greatest war in the history of Spain, and you are going to let this man leave who might bring you even greater glory. What do you lose by giving him 3 old ships? Almost nothing. The expenses are minimal compared to the costs of the war. But imagine what you will gain if he turns out to be right. New lands, untold treasures, millions of souls to convert to our holy faith. And now imagine the worst. You deny him your support, he goes to France, and the King of France gives him the ships, and he succeeds. All the glory, all the riches, all the new lands will go to your main enemies and rivals. Are you going to let that happen?" This argument, which struck at the very heart of royal pride and political ambition, proved decisive. Isabella, impulsive and determined, immediately sent a messenger after Columbus. Legend has it that she was even ready to pawn her own jewels to finance the expedition, although it didn't come to that. The money was finally found from various sources, including loans and confiscated property. On April 17th, 1492, in the military camp of Santa Fe, outside defeated Granada, the famous treaty was signed. The capitulations of Santa Fe, the conditions that Columbus had secured after so many years of humiliation, were truly royal. He was named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor-General for life of all the islands and continents he might discover. He would receive 1/10 of all treasures and revenues obtained from those lands. And, what was most incredible, all these titles would be passed down to his descendants by inheritance. After 7 years of humiliation and poverty, he, a simple weaver's son, had obtained more than any grandee of Spain possessed. At last, he had achieved everything he dreamed of, and even more. Now he only had to find the ships and the crew willing to accompany him on this insane journey, as many believed, to the end of the world. After receiving the royal decree and funding, Columbus headed to the port city of Palos de la Frontera. It was precisely this city, as punishment for some past offense against the crown, that was ordered to equip 2 caravels for the admiral. But a royal order is one thing, and the reality of a port city is quite another. The preparation of the expedition turned into an absolute nightmare from the start. No one wanted to join what all experienced sailors considered a suicide mission. The idea of sailing west, across the Sea of Darkness, until spotting land, seemed like pure madness. The sailors, upon hearing of the recruitment for Columbus's crew, literally hid, fled to taverns, or moved to other cities. Captains refused to give up their ships, fearing they would never see them again. Columbus, the foreigner, the Genoese, with his strange ideas and arrogant manners, was received in Palos with open, quiet hostility. The situation was saved by Martin Alonso Pinzon, one of the richest, most experienced, and respected shipowners and captains in all of Andalusia. Pinzon, unlike the others, was not just a simple sailor, he was an adventurer. He saw in Columbus's project not madness, but an opportunity. The opportunity to gain immense wealth and eternal glory. Did he believe in Columbus's calculations? Probably not, but he believed in his obsession, and he decided to take the risk. Pinzon not only provided one of his best caravels, La Pinta, but also, using his enormous authority, began personally recruiting sailors, his countrymen, for the crew. He promised them mountains of gold, and the people followed him. Him, not Columbus. His support was decisive. Finally, by the end of July, the small fleet was scraped together. It consisted of 3 ships. The flagship was La Santa Maria, a large but heavy and somewhat unmaneuverable 3-masted vessel, rented from another shipowner, as Columbus did not have a caravel of his own. It was the slowest ship in the squadron, alongside 2 light, fast, and maneuverable caravels. La Pinta, under the command of Martin Alonso Pinzon himself, and La Niña, captained by his brother, Vicente Yanez Pinzon. In total, aboard the 3 ships sailed about 90 people, Andalusian sailors, some court officials to keep the records, an interpreter who knew Arabic and Hebrew, since Columbus thought he was sailing to Asia, and even a jeweler to appraise the future treasures. On August 3rd, 1492, at dawn, after a mass and an emotional farewell from their families on the shore, the 3 small ships, almost toy-like by modern standards, set sail from the port of Palos and headed for the Canary Islands. The last known point on the map, the last bastion of civilization before jumping into the total and absolute unknown. They spent almost a month in the Canaries. La Pinta lost its rudder almost immediately, and Columbus was sure it was the first act of sabotage. The ships had to be repaired, and reserves of fresh water, firewood, and provisions replenished. Finally, on September 6th, the fleet left the Canary Islands, and taking advantage of the northeast trade winds, headed straight west into the immense, terrifying, and mythical Atlantic Ocean. The longest and most feared crossing in human history had begun. For the first few days, everything went surprisingly well. A steady, favorable wind blew. The weather was clear. The ships, driven by the trade winds, advanced safely westward at a speed of about 10 or 11 knots. But with each passing day, as the ships moved farther and farther away from the last visible land, a silent anxiety and then a dull, animalistic terror grew on board. The sailors, accustomed to coastal navigation, guiding themselves by familiar capes and stars, stared in horror at a horizon that looked absolutely identical on all 4 sides. A vast, empty, hostile blue immensity. Never in their lives had they been so far from land. Columbus, to maintain morale and hide the true situation, kept 2 logbooks. One, the official log, which he showed the crew every day. In it, he deliberately reduced the distance covered each day. The other, a secret one just for himself, where he kept the exact calculations. He understood that if the crew discovered how far they had ventured into that abyss, panic and mutiny would be inevitable. A week passed, then another. There was no land. The simple, monotonous life on the ship turned into torture. Every day was exactly the same as the last. Wake up at dawn, a brief prayer, a meager meal of weevil-infested hardtack and salted meat that had to be eaten in the dark so as not to see what you were eating. Then, the exhausting and monotonous watch, handling the sails, bailing water from the bilge, scrubbing the deck, and so on endlessly. Under the scorching sun during the day and in the cold, damp darkness of the night, the crew began to murmur. The sailors, simple and superstitious men, gathered on the deck. They whispered. They cast glances full of hatred at the foreign admiral, who spent his days alone on the command deck, staring to the west. They were convinced he was a madman, that he had sold his soul to the devil, and that he was leading them to certain death. They feared they had already passed the point of no return, and that they would never be able to sail back home against that cursed east wind constantly blowing at their backs. Columbus, sensing the growing threat of a mutiny, tried to encourage them. He used all his eloquence. He pointed out any sign of nearby land, no matter how insignificant. Birds flying by, which, as he knew, do not stray far from the coast. Clumps of green river weeds floating in the water. The changing color of the sky at sunset. But the days passed, and land did not appear. Finally, in early October, after almost 35 days since leaving the Canaries, the crew's patience ran out. On the flagship La Santa Maria, an open mutiny broke out. The sailors, armed with knives and axes, surrounded the admiral's cabin and demanded to turn back immediately, threatening to throw him overboard if he refused. It was the critical and decisive moment of the entire expedition. Columbus found himself alone, facing a furious and armed mob. And here he demonstrated not only courage, but incredible talent as a psychologist and diplomat. He did not threaten them with royal authority. He began to negotiate for their own lives and for his dream. He stepped out before them and asked for 3 more days. Just 3 days. If they didn't see land in those 3 days, he swore on his honor that he himself would give the order to return to Spain. The crew, after long and furious debates, reluctantly agreed. For Columbus, it was a desperate, ultimate gamble. He himself was already at his breaking point, his own almost fanatical confidence beginning to waver. Hours of agonizing, tense waiting passed. One day, two, no land. The tension on board reached its peak. And then, on the afternoon of October 10th, clear and undeniable signs appeared. The sailors of La Pinta pulled a fresh, green reed from the water, and then a small board, smooth and worked by human hands. The hope, which had almost been extinguished, flared up again with incredible new force. Columbus ordered no one to sleep all night, to take in most of the sails, so as not to overshoot the land in the dark, and to stare ahead intently until their eyes hurt. He even promised a lifelong pension of 10,000 maravedis to whoever saw land first. At 2 in the morning on October 12, 1492, the lookout on the caravel, La Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, peering intensely into the darkness, shouted at the top of his lungs, "Land! Land!" In the distance, under the faint moonlight, a low, white strip of sandy beach was visible. It was salvation. It was a triumph. It was the end of an endless nightmare. On the morning of October 12th, Christopher Columbus, dressed in his finest scarlet royal doublet, carrying the banner of Castile and Aragon, stepped ashore onto a small island covered with lush vegetation, which he would name San Salvador. He knelt down, kissed that longed-for and hard-won soil, and thanked God. He was absolutely and unshakably convinced that he had reached his goal. He was somewhere in Asia, on one of the thousands of islands that lay off the coast of India. For that very reason, he would call the astonished but friendly local inhabitants who came out to greet him Indians. This massive geographical error would be fixed in history forever. Columbus did not find what he was looking for. He found something much, immeasurably greater. He found a new world. The landing on the island, which the natives called Guanahani, and which Columbus, upon planting the banner of Castile and Aragon on the shore, immediately baptized as San Salvador. For the Europeans, it was an encounter with a world that seemed pulled from the pages of chivalric romances or biblical descriptions of paradise. After long, agonizing months in a salty, empty, monotonous ocean, they saw an explosion of color and life. The coast was covered with dense, lush, emerald green vegetation. The trees were unlike anything they had seen in Europe, towering, with enormous leaves and exotic fruits. The air was warm, humid, and sweet, thick with the heavy, intoxicating scent of unknown flowers and trees. The crystal-clear turquoise water of the lagoon was so transparent that every pebble and every colorful fish on the bottom could be seen. But the greatest miracle, the biggest shock for them, was the people. From the thickets along the shore, without fear, without aggression, emerged the local inhabitants, members of the Taino people. They were completely naked. Their bodies, slender and well-built, had a beautiful coppery tone. Their faces, with high cheekbones and straight black hair, expressed not hostility, but pure, childlike curiosity. They showed neither fear nor aggression. On the contrary, they stared in wonder at the strange newcomers, bearded, wrapped in heavy, thick clothes, their pale skin, their shining armor, and the incomprehensible objects they carried in their hands. They offered the Spaniards simple gifts, balls of cotton thread, brightly colored tamed parrots screeching in an unknown tongue, exotic fruits. Columbus, fanatically convinced that he was somewhere on the outskirts of Asia, on one of the thousands of islands stretching off the coast of India, immediately called these people Indians. He described them in his logbook with enthusiasm, yet at the same time with the cold, pragmatic condescension of a colonizer. They are very gentle people, without knowledge of evil, nor of killing others. They are the best people in the world, and the gentlest. But behind this superficial admiration lay the sober, cynical calculation of the colonist. He immediately noted for himself and for his sovereigns, they are fit to be ordered about and made to work. They should be good Christians. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we wish. But Columbus's main objective wasn't souls or slaves. His single, all-consuming obsession was gold. He saw that some of the Indians wore small gold ornaments in their noses, and this became his confirmation. He was on the right track. There was gold here, He began his interrogation. Through gestures, drawings in the sand, he tried to find out where they got that yellow metal. Gold? Sipangu? The Great Khan? The Indians, unable to understand his language and eager to be rid of the insistent, frightening newcomers, simply pointed south or west, saying that far away there was a large island where the chiefs wore enormous gold bracelets. And Columbus, taking these vague gestures as precise directions, began his feverish, almost mad journey through the islands of the Caribbean Sea. He discovered Cuba, which amazed him with its size. He was sure it was the continent, the coast of China. He even sent an embassy into the island's interior with a letter for the Great Khan. But the ambassadors, of course, found no imperial palaces or wealthy cities, only humble native villages. He then reached Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, an island that impressed him with its beauty, its fertility, and, above all, the apparent abundance of gold dust in its rivers. It was a strange and surreal navigation. The ships, those little slivers of wood, slowly advanced along unknown and paradisiacal coasts, mapping new islands, bays, and capes. Every day brought new discoveries and bitter new disappointments. They found a pristine, astonishing nature, landscapes that looked otherworldly, friendly natives willing to trade gold nuggets for cheap trinkets like broken plate fragments or copper bells. But they didn't find the main prize. There were no rich, populous cities, no palaces with golden roofs, no caravans loaded with spices. This was not the fabulous, civilized India described by Marco Polo. It was a different, strange, primitive world. The relations with the Indians, initially almost idyllic, began to deteriorate rapidly. The sailors, who had spent months at sea and were tired of deprivation, started acting with brutality. They took food from the natives, demanded women, and forcefully seized their modest gold ornaments. Trust turned into fear, and fear into hatred. Around this time, the first major crack in the expedition itself occurred. Martin Alonso Pinzon, the captain of the fast caravel La Pinta, an ambitious and experienced man who considered himself, not Columbus, the true hero of the journey, decided to act on his own. Hearing from the Indians another legend about a mythical island of gold called Babeke, he disobeyed a direct order from the admiral, split from the fleet during the night, and went searching for treasure on his own. Columbus was left with 2 ships, one of which, his flagship La Santa Maria, was the slowest and clumsiest. And then, on Christmas night in 1492, disaster struck. After the festive dinner, when the entire crew, exhausted from their watch, was sound asleep, the helmsman on duty, violating all naval regulations, handed the tiller over to a young cabin boy and went to sleep. During the night, La Santa Maria, silently carried by the current, ran gently aground on a coral reef off the coast of Hispaniola. The ship was lost. The waves, although small, began to pound its hull against the corals. The masts collapsed. The expedition's flagship, Columbus's pride, was turning into a pile of rubble right before his eyes. Columbus found himself in a desperate, almost hopeless situation. He only had 1 ship left, the smallest one, La Niña, which physically could not hold all the surviving sailors for the long and dangerous return voyage to Spain. But even in this catastrophe, Columbus, a deeply religious man prone to seeing signs of destiny in everything, did not see a failure, but a sign from Providence. He decided it was a sign that they should found the first Spanish colony right there in that blessed land. Using the remains of La Santa Maria on the shore, with the help of the local Indians ruled by the friendly cacique Guacanagari, they built a small fort with a tower and a moat. They called it La Navidad, since the shipwreck occurred on Christmas Day. Columbus left about 40 of his men at the fort, giving them strict orders to find the alleged gold deposits, maintain peace with the Indians, and await his return. In early January, Martin Pinzon's La Pinta, having failed to find his island of gold, returned. Columbus, hiding his anger and understanding that without a second ship he could not return, welcomed the prodigal captain back. Now, crammed into the 2 remaining caravels, they could finally head home to bring the incredible news to Spain. The journey back was even more terrifying than the voyage out. While a steady, favorable trade wind had pushed them west, they now had to fight headwinds and the fierce winter storms of the North Atlantic. In mid-February, the ships were caught in a monstrous hurricane that lasted for days. In complete darkness, amidst towering, roaring waves, La Pinta and La Niña lost sight of each other. Columbus, aboard his tiny La Niña, creaking at every joint, was certain his ship would sink at any moment, and that the news of his great discovery would perish with him, leading him to perform his most famous, almost theatrical act. On a piece of parchment, he briefly described everything he had discovered. He asked whoever found it to deliver it to the Queen of Spain. He sealed the parchment inside a barrel and tossed it into the raging ocean. He wanted history to know of his triumph, even if he himself perished. But La Niña survived, by a miracle. Battered, with broken masts, it finally reached the Azores, and, after another terrible storm, the shores of Portugal, the very country that had once dismissively rejected his project. King John II, upon hearing of his return and his incredible discoveries, immediately summoned him. It was a tense meeting, full of veiled threats. The king accused Columbus of having violated the Treaty of Tordesillas and encroaching on the Portuguese sphere of influence. But Columbus, no longer a humble supplicant but a conqueror, admiral of the ocean sea and viceroy of the new lands, behaved boldly, confidently, almost defiantly. Finally, on March 15th, 1493, 7.5 months after his departure, Christopher Columbus's La Niña pulled into the very same port of Palos from which it had sailed into the unknown. And on that very same day, guided by Providence or a stray wind, Martin Pinson's La Pinta, which had also miraculously survived the storm, sailed in as well. The circle was complete. The incredible journey that changed the world had ended. The news of Columbus's return and his incredible discoveries spread through Spain like wildfire. What seemed like a reckless adventure had become the greatest of triumphs. The admiral, considered a madman barely a year earlier, was now a national hero. His journey from Palos to Barcelona, where the royal court was located at the time, became an endless triumphal march. In every city he passed through, jubilant crowds came out to meet him. People rushed from their homes just to see him, to see the man who had returned from another world. But the main object of their curiosity was his exotic entourage. Columbus brought back living proof of his discovery. Several Taino Indians he had brought with him, adorned with colorful feathers, cages with never-before-seen, screeching parrots, strange plants, and most importantly, a little gold, nuggets, gold dust in glass vials, and the simple but highly promising gold ornaments of the natives. The reception at the royal court in Barcelona was staged with maximum pomp. Isabella and Ferdinand did not receive him like a simple captain, but like the greatest grandee in Spain. They stood up in his presence, an unheard of honor. They seated him beside them, and for hours, with their hearts in their throats, listened to his tale. Columbus was on top of the world. He spoke of paradisiacal islands, of kind-hearted natives who would be very easy to convert to Christianity, and above all, of the untold reserves of gold that he was sure lay very near. He was absolutely convinced that he had reached the shores of Asia and that the islands he had discovered were just the anteroom to the fabulously wealthy lands of China and Japan. The monarchs were delighted. They confirmed all his titles and privileges granted in the capitulations of Santa Fe. He was Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor-General of all the discovered lands. He received his own coat of arms. They showered him with honors and money. Preparations for a second expedition began immediately. But this time, it was no longer a small, risky adventure. It was a massive, state-sponsored colonial operation. Instead of 3 old caravels, an entire armada of 17 ships set sail. Instead of 90 adventurous sailors, 1,500 people. Soldiers, officials, priests, craftsmen, farmers. They brought not only weapons, but also horses, cattle, seeds, tools. They weren't sailing to discover, but to settle and develop. But already during this second expedition, which began in 1493, the first disturbing cracks in the myth of the paradisiacal lands began to show. When the fleet reached Hispaniola, the spot where Columbus had left Fort La Navidad, a terrifying sight awaited them. The fort had been reduced to ashes, and the 40 Spaniards he had left behind were dead. What happened remains unclear. Either they fought amongst themselves over gold and women, or their cruelty toward the local Indians finally triggered a bloody revenge. The idyllic first contact was over. The era of conquest had begun. Columbus founded a new colony, La Isabela, but it was doomed from the start. The colonists, who had crossed the ocean in search of easy gold, were not ready for hard labor. Unknown tropical diseases decimated them. Famine broke out. The gold, which Columbus promised could just be picked up off the ground, did not exist. It had to be extracted through grueling, exhausting work in the mines. And here, the dark side of Columbus revealed itself. From a brilliant navigator, he turned into a cruel and completely inept administrator. He didn't know how to govern people. He tried to force the Spanish hidalgos, who considered any physical labor humiliating, to work in the mines. He imposed a cruel tribute system on the Indians. Every tribe was required to deliver a certain amount of gold dust every 3 months. Those who failed to meet the quota were brutally punished, their hands chopped off. The friendly Tainos, whom he had once described as the best people in the world, were now dying by the thousands in the mines, from diseases brought by the Europeans, or committing suicide. Unable to bear the slave labor, the colony plunged into chaos. The Spaniards mutinied. The Indians rebelled. An endless stream of complaints reached Spain, accusing Columbus and his brothers of tyranny, incompetence, and hiding royal revenues. His second and third expeditions brought new geographical discoveries. He discovered the Lesser Antilles, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and explored the coast of South America. But he never found the main goal, a direct route to India and its untold riches. His reputation at court was fading day by day. In the year 1500, during his third voyage, the crown's patience ran out. A special royal inspector, Francisco de Bobadilla, was sent to the colony with absolute power. Arriving in Hispaniola and seeing the reigning chaos, Bobadilla, without a second thought, arrested Columbus and his 2 brothers. The unthinkable happened. He, the admiral of the ocean sea, the viceroy of the Indies, the man who had gifted Spain a new world, was put in chains like a common criminal and sent back to Spain in the hold of a ship to stand trial. It was the peak of his humiliation. When he arrived in Cadiz, news of his arrest shocked the country. The monarchs, of course, ordered his immediate release and summoned him to court. They returned his wealth, but not his titles, and most importantly, not his power. His monopoly on discoveries was shattered. Dozens of other captains, younger and luckier, had already rushed west, discovering new lands and bringing real, not mythical, treasures to Spain. Columbus's star had burned out. Returning to Spain in chains at the end of the year, 1500 was the most terrible humiliation of Christopher Columbus's life. When the ship arrived in Cadiz, according to witnesses, he refused to have his chains removed until he appeared personally before the monarchs. He wanted the sovereigns to see how they had treated the man who gave them an empire. The news of the arrest of the admiral of the ocean sea caused a massive scandal in Spain. Isabella and Ferdinand, naturally, ordered his immediate release, paid him compensation, and welcomed him at court with outward signs of respect. But it was nothing more than hypocrisy. The humiliating charges of tyranny and incompetence brought against him by the royal inspector were dropped, but the essence remained unchanged. Columbus was a brilliant navigator, but an absolutely inept ruler. His time had passed. His monopoly on discoveries and all his royal powers, granted in the capitulations of Santa Fe, were effectively stripped from him. Another man was appointed as the new governor of Hispaniola. Dozens of other captains, younger, luckier, and more pragmatic, like Amerigo Vespucci, Alonso de Ojeda, and Vicente Pinzon, had already sailed west, exploring and mapping new coastlines that they, unlike Columbus, were already beginning to understand as a new, separate continent. Columbus, meanwhile, at court, was obsessed with a final, desperate idea. He still fanatically believed that the lands he had discovered were Asia. He was convinced that somewhere among those islands, a strait had to exist, a strait that would lead him from the Caribbean Sea directly into the Indian Ocean to the fabulous wealth of India. He believed that if he found that strait, he would regain his glory, his wealth, and the respect of the crown. For 2 years he begged in the corridors of power, pleading, arguing, showing his maps. Finally, in 1502, the monarchs, perhaps simply wishing to be rid of the persistent old man, gave him permission for a 4th and final voyage. But the conditions were humiliating. They gave him 4 old, battered ships, and he was strictly forbidden from docking at Hispaniola, the main port of the colony he himself had founded. This voyage was plagued by bad luck from the start. When Columbus, now over 50 years old, approached the shores of Hispaniola, leaning on his vast maritime experience, he predicted the arrival of a terrible hurricane. He asked the new governor for permission to take shelter in the port. The governor, mocking him, denied the request. At that very moment, a massive fleet of 30 ships was leaving the port, loaded with gold destined for the Spanish treasury. Columbus begged him not to let them set sail. They laughed at him again. He took his 4 small ships and managed to find refuge in a bay. The next day, a hurricane of monstrous force slammed into the island. Of the 30 ships in the gold fleet, 25 sank. Hundreds of people died, including Columbus's main enemy, the Inspector Bobadilla, who had arrested him. And Columbus's 4 old ships, battered but intact, emerged from their shelter. For him, it was a sign of God's judgment. He continued his journey west in a desperate search for the mythical strait. He explored the entire coast of Central America, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. It was an agonizing, grueling journey. The ships were eaten away by shipworms and constantly took on water. The crew was decimated by tropical diseases. The Indians greeted them with increasing hostility, and the strait never appeared. In the end, having lost 2 ships, with the remaining 2 barely staying afloat, Columbus was forced to turn back. But they never made it to Hispaniola. The ships were falling apart. He was forced to run them aground on the coast of the island of Jamaica. The last and most humiliating chapter of his odyssey began. The great admiral, the discoverer, found himself playing the role of Robinson Crusoe. He and his crew spent an entire year in Jamaica, in complete isolation, suffering from hunger and the hostility of the Indians, who refused to give them food. And here, Columbus performed his last brilliant, almost mystical act. He knew from his astronomical tables that a total lunar eclipse was set to occur on February 29th, 1504. He summoned the Indian caciques and announced that his god, as punishment for their lack of hospitality, had decided to take the moon away from them. When, at the appointed hour, the moon actually began to turn red and vanish from the sky, the terrified Indians threw themselves at his feet, begging him to bring the moon back and promising to bring him all the food he needed. Columbus, after praying in his cabin, returned the moon to them. The food supply was restored. Only a year later, one of his loyal officers, in a small canoe, managed to reach Hispaniola and bring back help. Exhausted and sick, Columbus and the remnants of his crew were rescued. In 1504, he finally returned to Spain. But it was the return of a ghost. He was old, sick, broken, and his main protector, Queen Isabella, was on her deathbed. After her passing, he was completely forgotten. He spent the last 2 years of his life in Valladolid, in a modest house, locked in endless, humiliating lawsuits with the crown, trying to recover his lost titles and revenues. But no one was listening anymore. He died on May 20th, 1506, in poverty and almost total oblivion. He died without ever fully understanding what he had actually discovered. Until his final day, he was absolutely and fanatically convinced that he had only found a new route to the old familiar Asia. The irony of fate decreed that the new continent he gifted to the world would not bear his name, but that of another Italian, Amerigo Vespucci, who merely described these new lands. Thus ended the journey of a man whose great mistake became the greatest of discoveries. A journey that began with triumph and ended in oblivion. But his true, immortal legacy was just beginning its march through history. The death of Christopher Columbus in Valladolid in 1506 passed almost unnoticed. There were no state funerals or grandiose obituaries. The great admiral of the ocean sea, the man who had literally expanded the boundaries of the known world, died forgotten, like a pesky beggar who had lost his final legal battle against the crown. His body was first buried in Valladolid, then moved to Seville, and later, according to history, to the island of Hispaniola that he had discovered. And from there, his traces are lost to the centuries. Today, several cities around the world dispute the right to house his remains. His posthumous destiny turned out to be as turbulent as his life. So, what is his legacy? It is immense, contradictory, and tragic. On the one hand, Columbus is, without a doubt, one of the key figures in human history. His voyage in 1492 is not just another discovery. It is a point of no return. It is an event that divided history into a before and an after. It brought an end to the Middle Ages and ushered in the modern age. It finally closed the geographical map of the world, connecting two hemispheres that had developed in complete isolation for tens of thousands of years. He was a brilliant navigator. His courage, his unwavering, almost mad faith in his idea, his ability to lead his men in an absolutely desperate situation, his navigational talent, all of this is unquestionable. He was not the first European to reach the shores of America. The Vikings did it 500 years before him, but it was his discovery that had irreversible consequences. After him, the road to the New World lay wide open, and down that road flowed a current that could no longer be stopped. His voyages initiated the Columbian Exchange, the greatest transfer of goods, cultures, plants, and animals in history between the Old and the New World. From America to Europe came the potato, the tomato, corn, cacao, tobacco, products that forever changed European cuisine and economics. From Europe to America went horses, cows, wheat, vines, but along with them also came diseases. And here begins the second, dark side of his legacy. The discovery of America became a catastrophe, a genocide for its indigenous population. The diseases brought by the Europeans, smallpox, measles, flu, against which the Indians had zero immunity, wiped out, according to various estimates, up to 90% of the continent's population. It was one of the most terrible demographic catastrophes in human history. Columbus himself, as we have seen, was a cruel and inept administrator. His thirst for gold and his inability to govern the colonies launched a system of brutal exploitation and slavery that would reign in the New World for centuries. The friendly Taino people, who welcomed him with gifts, were practically annihilated in just a few decades. And, finally, the greatest tragedy of Columbus himself, the tragedy of his genius. He made the greatest discovery, but he never understood it. Until his dying breath, he remained absolutely and fanatically convinced that he had only found a new western route to the old, known Asia. He died believing that Cuba was part of China and that South America was the earthly paradise described in the Bible. He was looking for one thing and found something immeasurably greater, but he could never grasp the sheer magnitude of his own feat. The irony of fate also lies in the fact that the vast new continent was not christened with his name, but with that of another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, who was simply one of the first to express the bold conjecture that the discovered lands were not Asia, but an entirely new continent, a mundus novus, a new world. So, who was this man? A hero or a villain? A genius or a lucky madman? A discoverer or the first colonizer? He was all of those things at once. A product of his time, a cruel religious era, greedy for gold and glory. He was a man whose greatest mistake became the greatest of discoveries. And his story is an eternal, tragic reminder that great geographical discoveries and massive human tragedies are often two sides of the same coin, and that sometimes, to discover a new world, you first have to get lost in the old one. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, please subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let us know in the comments what you think about Columbus's complicated legacy.